But discussions around it rarely happen, if at all, and if we see them. And I'm going to put this out there that, this is my perspective on this. So if you are lucky enough to be having these conversations, with friends and socially, then that's amazing. I don't personally see it, and nor that I want to have these conversations with, my mother or my father or my sisters, any of that, and I don't know if anyone wants to have those conversations, but socially, it happens very rarely, especially within the Tamil community and South Asian community in general. And so we see it as very negative, as taboo is wrong a lot of the time, or we fear it. It's a very hard topic to talk about. I work in sexuality and sexual health, but if my sister wants to talk to me about something about this, I even cringe at that, right? And it shouldn't be the reaction, but that's what it is, right? And sometimes these discussions do happen, but there isn't control over the dialogue. So it might be, a new bride and the elders, the women are talking to her about, the wedding night and what that means with this intent of popping out children. And there might be that conversation happening. I don't know because I wasn't in that conversation, but somebody told me to mention that. So I'm going to go with that and mention it. And so I put that out there because, these conversations could happen. And, a bunch of straight guys might be talking about, who they hooked up with. And that might be something that they want to brag about. But that's a closed thing. That it doesn't say, oh, did you use protection? Or, are you getting tested after? None of those other discussions are happening, right? So it's very quick, it's very narrow, and it's very limited. So what happens to the activity that we don't talk about? Does it just stop? Clearly not. I've mentioned that before with the whole condom analogy. And instead, these forbidden activities still occur, but without proper education around it. People are afraid to ask the questions around their individual health and how it's affected, and how to protect themselves. It's not for a lack of resources out there, because I'm telling you, condoms, yes, they're expensive, but we have free condoms coming out of everywhere. Like universities give it out, agencies give it out, Toronto Public Health gives it out. It's not that we don't have these resources, it's around the idea of shame, the rumors that are come up with that. So if we're accessing this, are we accessing it in a way that people are going to see us, acknowledge us? Sometimes I'll get a call saying, hey, is it possible to get condoms? And a person will say they want to access it, they know we have it for free, they can get it from us. Can you put it in an envelope and then put it into a plastic bag and then leave it in the front entrance and I'll come pick it up at a certain time? And this is not an uncommon thing. This happens, I've heard this story from a lot of other agencies dealing with ethno-specific groups. And so this is not just isolated. They don't even want to be seen coming into our space. Now luckily, our office is in an office building where there's law offices and travel agencies and stuff like that, but it's very closed off. There isn't any, you can't just see it when you walk in from the street. You have to go upstairs, it's fairly hidden, so anonymity is there. And confidentiality is something that's really important to that, and to all the work we do, because a lot of what we do and the people we deal with aren't out to their peers, aren't out to their families, or about their sexuality, or their sexual health. So let's say they're HIV positive, and they're not communicating that to people that they know in their lives. For fear of discrimination, we have to keep that in confidentiality. We have to maintain that with everything we do. So I can't talk about a person who's in, Snathan and, has come to meetings and told me this great story. I can't talk about that outside of here, especially with associating their identity to it. Sexuality and stigma. So sex itself is already so stigmatized, and it's not in a category of suitable topics, but when we're talking about sexuality, or same-sex relationships, same-sex sex, whatever, usually elicits a stronger response. So all these negative stereotypes that you're going to think of come to mind. And I'm not saying everyone has that, but a lot of people do have that. And even if they don't, like me, even when I was coming out, realizing the fact that, there's a potential that, somebody I come out to could feel those ways, can feel those negative feelings towards me, even though I don't know, because they haven't come out to say that, they're okay with people being gay, because you don't just go around saying, oh yeah, I'm okay with, gays, they're really cool, blah, 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 blah. That fear of even the individual coming out is there, that, the family, the friends that they might tell, might react negatively, and where does that put them? Especially if they're in a precarious situation where they don't have the finances or the luxury to, get out of their situations. And so, we get sick, we get dysfunctional, mentally ill, we get perverted, we get, we don't get that way, we get those as stereotypes, projections towards us. And then people think that we're in love with every straight person that we meet. They think it's contagious. These are all things that are common. They think we all wear pink. I love pink, but that's not a thing that's just associated. They think we all fall under this specific category. I was doing a workshop in in Jane and Finch earlier in the summer with a group which was predominantly Tamil women, and there were some women that were in Tamil. I believe they were new from the Caribbean, and when we asked the Tamil women what were the negative aspects that they heard about, like gays, like what do you think? And I want the negative to come out, because I want people to talk about that, to address it, because we don't talk about it, we don't acknowledge it, and it becomes invisible. When things become invisible, they become implicit, and then it just keeps going. But when I asked them, they were all really shy to even talk about that. They won't say it straight up. Some of the women from the other communities were okay with talking about that, and so they mentioned, wearing really tight clothes, dancing around, they're sick, whatever. But the Tamil women, they came up with some, but not as many as other communities, because they don't want to talk about that. And it's the same thing applies to when you're talking about sex. You don't want to talk about it. It becomes this thing that's invisible. But things that exist that you treat as invisible don't go away, right? They still exist. You're just pushing them into another margin. Stereotypes. So when we're talking about MSM, I want to just touch on this once again, because MSM is a category we use because a lot of people identify as straight. They don't want to identify as being gay, bi, even if that's what their actions are, or pansexual, if you want to throw that out there, because it means that they are lesser than, or it means that they're going to be labeled as all those stereotypes that come to mind. So I had this conversation with my mother. She was saying that, if you're going to do a speech about something, don't just start off with saying you're gay, or don't just start off with saying that, because then that's all people see you for. And so we have this like ingrained in our minds that we need to prove ourselves to be, the best of what we do, and then come out. And why does that have to happen? Why do we need to do, it's great for everyone to achieve this certain status and, fight for being the best at what they do and whatever they're passionate at, but why do we need to prove ourselves as individuals first and then talk about orientation? Because people, when they hear your orientation, automatically all those stereotypes come to mind. I've had friends that I knew my whole life, and when I decided to come out, those stereotypes came up. And they automatically assume that I'm going to be good at fashion, that I'm going to be good at cooking, I'm going to be good at this, that, and the other. And it becomes this, why are all these things associated? Yes, I might be good at all those things, but I was great at it before that I am right now, it's not like that something has changed, but you've known my take on all these things for such a long time. Why has that changed? And that fear comes out when you're in different workspaces. I luckily enough work in a space where I can be open about my sexuality. I can also be open about my cultural identity. Growing up, I wasn't able to have that openness about my cultural identity. People automatically assumed I was Indian. And the word Tamil didn't exist to most of the kids I knew growing up. Again, I grew up in a very white neighborhood of the city. And so when that happened, it was like, okay, I continuously got used to just being, oh yeah, my name's Ram. Not Ram Raj, Ram, because it was the easiest way for people to associate with me. I still, to this day, if I meet someone who's brown, now I'm used to saying Ram or Ram Raj, but if I meet someone who's white, I'll automatically say Ram. And if some of my friends who know me as Ram see me, they laugh. And I don't do this on purpose, it just happens instinctually. Hiding parts of your identity for who you are. That same thing applies to your orientation. If you're going to have to make this assumption that, everyone is straight, or if you're gay, something's going to be indicative of it, you're going to constantly be on the defensive about being masculine, being hyper-masculine, not drawing any femininity, scared of wearing pink, almost being homophobic in some situations, and in a lot of situations, people being homophobic. And that ties into a lot of the identities that I'm seeing with a lot of the clients. So I'm not just saying this talking about myself, but because a lot of people have these examples, and it comes out in these support spaces of acting like, oh, well, they're too gay, why do they have to act that way? Well, they can act however they want. It should be irrelevant. It shouldn't affect the way you are. It shouldn't affect the way anyone else sees them. That's just who they are. I might be going on tangents, so bring it home if I am. Okay, so the last piece I wanted to touch on is the support spaces, which I find to be the most important spaces when you're talking about the MSM community. I'm not going to say MSM. I will say gay now for the sake of it. I've already explained what it means, so we're just going to say gay. The gay support spaces like Snathan and M2u00020 D. When I was first coming out, I wasn't even out to myself, and I was already in my early 20s. I entered a university space. There was a queer organization there. Again, I didn't know any brown people there. There were a couple of people of color. When I accessed that space, I thought myself that I was very I knew who I was and all that jazz, and I was just going out for curiosity's sake. There's a long story even behind that process, but I'm going to leave that for later. I love talking about myself, so we can talk after if you want to have parts here. When I accessed that space, I became almost addicted to being in that space. And the reason was because there were people in that space that shared very similar stories and very similar narratives as mine. So when they were struggling about how do they tell their family about them coming out, or how did they act in high school when everyone was straight, there weren't any gay-straight alliances, and how they carried themselves in those spaces, I related to a lot of those stories. And I didn't know this existed. I didn't know this dialogue existed, because anything I saw that was queer was either used in a joke, so saying fag, or saying, you know, you're such a homo, all that stuff was used in a very negative context growing up. Like, even as a kid, I used to use the word fag, because I just thought of it as a irrelevant joke, right? Or you see examples on television of like Will and Grace, and you just saw one sort of perception of what gay was. And that becomes very dangerous, because when you think that this is the only thing out there, you don't think that there is anything else like you in a certain way. So you think there must be something wrong, and you internalize that deeply, and a lot of people internalize that. And so when I came into that space, that support space, even in university, and that didn't even have a cultural aspect to it, it was a new home to me. It was a place that I felt comfortable, that I could be able to talk about who I was, and I wasn't even having those conversations with myself at that point. And so it was a really important space for me to be in. So I just want to like emphasize the fact of how important it was for me, because I don't have the same experience Vijay's going to have when he talks about Snathan. And so we operate two groups, those three which started a little bit earlier, and which is predominantly, we call it General South Asian MSM group. It was predominantly North Indian earlier on. It's now become more mixed and diverse. And then we have Snathan. And so when I started with ASAP, Snathan had been on hiatus for a while. So there's been a few months that it wasn't in, and I hadn't heard about it before I started. Mind you, my scope of my work with ASAP is about almost 2 years now. And so when we were trying to restart the organization, there was a lot of struggles in getting people to come out. How do you advertise a space that, you know, is going to be very confidential for people, and you don't know how to get a lot of the people to come out there? How are you going to connect with people? How are you going to keep them coming? And I was starting from scratch, and I'd also had no experience working in facilitating a group like that with gay Tamil men, which I didn't know existed. So I'm going to be starting a group with a bunch of guys that the only reason I knew they existed is because I did, not because I saw them or interacted with them on a daily basis. And so I used a lot of advice from people who were in the program before and doing a lot of the work with them. And so we sent out invites, and you know, we had meetings, and we found that there were fewer numbers than expected coming out, but this was granted because the organization was starting again. And then for a month or two we took a hiatus, and we decided, you know what, we're going to try joining these meetings with the Doski sessions and see if the turnout changes and to observe what happens. And we did for a while, and in some meetings that we had as joint sessions, it was a majority Snathan individuals. So out of like, you know, 15 people, 12 of them would be Tamil. And we were like, what's going on here? What's happening? And then we started talking to some of the newcomers into the group, not newcomers in general, but new members of Snathan, as to what was going on. And they said, you know, we know about this organization, we know about this group, we know it's happening, but a lot of the people who want to come, who need the service, because a lot of the people who were a part of Snathan years ago, you know, found their place with it, found what they were able to get what they needed from it, and, you know, moved on with their lives in whatever capacity. They played their purpose in their lives, and now they were at a different point, and they felt, you know, it wasn't relevant to them at that time. So a lot of the people we're looking for are newcomers that don't have a support system and haven't built that yet. Or youth who think that, like, you know, we're like me and thought that, you know, the only spaces are predominantly white spaces to find, you know, the support that we needed. And so a lot of the newcomer perspective is what I'm touching on right now, is they felt that, you know, being associated with a Tamil group was very dangerous to their immigration status and very dangerous as to who they were, especially with like the recent the political climate and the media climate around how the Tamils are being portrayed in the media, how it's become very like hyper racist, and everyone is just like, the way Tamil is perceived in the mainstream media now is very negative. And so a lot of that transferred into the group, and so people assume that because it was Tamil, we were going to discuss all of the home politics and all that stuff, which we don't. This is not the platform that we're talking about other issues here in this group. And so people thought that, you know, because being associated with a group that had Tamil in the name, that was to jeopardize that, or jeopardize their status in some way, or that people would find out, especially because it was from like a bigger organization, and you know, having a Tamil group in any capacity, you know, as much as they need that space, they had other fears coming out because of all that politics and the political climate and the portrayals in the media. But right now, we still have a lot of members coming out. We're currently going through a slight restructuring, but we still have members coming every 4th Friday of the month. So if anyone's interested, get in contact with me about meeting places and all that jazz. Every 4th Friday of the month, we have a meeting in the evening, and it's a great one. And sometimes, you know, we intersperse them with, they're usually discussion groups, but it acts as I like to call it a social support space. So I'm not like certified to do counseling or anything but like that, but it's a peer support space. So these you come into this space where you're able to share your experiences and learn from each other and also relate to each other, so you don't feel isolated and alone. And a lot of what happens out of that is it becomes a social thing. So it isn't limited to that space. So a lot of people interact with each other outside of the group. And I'm gonna leave it at that before I get into too much over there. So yeah, back to the initial question of what I was talking about. Where is the space for Tamil gay men, gay bi men, or MSM? And to be honest, I'm still entirely in the dark about it. Like if I knew where all these gay men are, probably wouldn't be single, and I probably would be probably would have a larger following at these support spaces. And so, you know, it's really hard because not only are we marginalized as a visible minority in this, and you know, on top of that being Tamil, being further marginalized, but then we have the sexual identity that comes in that. So we're like within these like layers of margins that I can't even count at this point. And so, yeah, I mean, as a Tamil community, I think this is an amazing thing happening right now, and I hope to see more of it, and I'm going to stop for discussions later.
So I'm just going to briefly give the gist of what Ram's presentation was in Tamil. இப்பொழுது மிகவும் ரத்தின சுருக்கமாக இவருடைய பேச்சின் சாரத்தை உங்களுடன் பகிர்ந்து கொள்கிறேன். தமிழில் பேசி இந்த டாபிக்கை பற்றி தமிழில் பேசுவது சரியான கஷ்டம். பிகாஸ் அந்த மொழி வந்து இந்த ரியாலிட்டி, இந்த உண்மைகளை வெளிக்கொண்டு வரதுக்கு உகந்த மொழி அல்ல தமிழ். பிகாஸ் ஆங்கிலத்தில் பாலியலை பற்றி சார்ந்த அந்த சொற்கள் ஆங்கிலத்தில் இருந்து தான் மொழிபெயர்த்து வந்துள்ளது. ஓரின சேர்க்கை, ஹோமோசெக்சுவல். ஆனா ஆங்கில சொற்கள் வந்து மருத்துவ ரீதியான ஒரு தளத்திலிருந்து தான் செக்ஷுவல், பாலியலை பற்றி தமிழ்ல ஆங்கிலத்திலேயே பேசப்படுகிறது. அதுவும் ஒரு செயல், செக்ஸ், அந்த செயலை மையமாக வச்சுதான் ஆங்கிலத்திலும் தமிழ்லையும் பேசப்படுகிறது. ஆனா தமிழ்ல வந்து உறவுகளுக்கு எவ்வளவோ சொற்கள் இருக்குது. உறவுட தன்மையை பற்றி, மனைவி, பாரியார், பெரிய வீடு, சின்ன வீடு, வெவ்வேறு விதமான சொற்கள் இருக்குது. அந்த உறவை பற்றி, நாட் தி அந்த ஆக்ஷன் இல்ல, செக்ஸ் என்ற அந்த ஆக்ஷன் இல்ல, உறவை மையமாக வச்சு. ஆனா அந்த ஓரின சேர்க்கை ரியாலிட்டிஸை பற்றி கதை கேட்க எங்களுக்கு அந்த மொழி இல்லை. ஸோ மிகவும் வருத்தத்துக்குரிய ஒரு விஷயம். ராம் என்ற இந்த young person, handsome young man, அவர் வந்து ஏசாப்ல 2 வருடமாக கடமையாற்றுறார். அவருடைய ப்ராஜெக்ட் வந்து MSM என்று சொல்ற ஒரு குரூப், ஆண்களோட குரூப் மையமாக வச்சுதான் அவருடைய ப்ராஜெக்ட். அப்ப அவருடைய முதல் பகுதியான பேச்சு MSM என்றால் என்ன ஒரு இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங்கான ஒரு விளக்கம் கொண்டு கொடுத்தவர். அப்ப இந்த ஆண்கள் வந்து மோஸ்ட்லி தமிழ், பிகாஸ் அதான் நம்மளோட பொசிஷன், தமிழ் MSM கோஆர்டினேட்டர். அவையில் வந்து கே என்ற ஒரு அடையாளத்தை தாங்களும் உணரவில்லை, சமுதாயத்திற்கும் அதை அறிவிக்கிறதாக இல்லை. ஆனா அப்புறம் ஆண்களுடன் புணர்வதற்கு அவர்களுக்கு இச்சை உண்டு. ஸோ அவையில் வந்து அந்த தளங்களை இரவிலையும் மற்றது ரகசியமாகவும் தேடி ஆண்களுடன் புணர்ந்து வாழ்கிற ஒரு குரூப் ஆஃப் மென். அப்ப கே என்றது வந்து ஒரு அரசியல் ரீதியான ஒரு அடையாளம், விழிப்புணர்ச்சி அடைந்த ஒரு அடையாளம். அவர்கள் அந்த அடையாளத்தை உள்வாங்குவதில்லை, பிரதிபலிப்பதும் இல்லை. அப்ப இந்த ஆண்களுக்காக தான் அந்த ஏசாவில் ஒரு கோஆர்டினேட்டராக ராம் விளங்குகிறார். இந்த MSM என்ற குரூப், men who have sex with men, அவையில் வந்து எங்கேயும் இருக்கலாம், மோஸ்ட்லி 905 ஜோக். அப்ப அவர்கள் டவுன்டவுன்ல இல்ல ஸ்காப்ரோ அந்த மற்ற சபர்ப்ஸ்ல இருந்து அவள் டவுன்டவுனுக்கு வந்து தங்களோட இச்சையை அடக்கி கொண்டு திருப்பி போயிடுவீங்க. அவள் கல்யாணம் கட்டி இருக்கலாம், பிள்ளைகளோட இருக்கலாம். ஸோ அதுதான் அவர் முதல் விளங்கப்படுத்தினவர். ரெண்டாவது மிகவும் இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங்கான ஒரு விடயம் அவர் எடுத்து சொன்னவர் என்றால் செக்ஸ். தமிழ் சமுதாயத்துல குறிப்பாக தமிழ் ஊடகங்கள் மற்ற தளங்கள் இடங்களை செக்ஸ் உடனே அவை வந்து சமாந்தரம் இல்லாட்டி ஈக்குவல் ஷேம், வெட்கம். செக்ஸை பற்றி பேசுறதுக்கே வெட்கம், செக்ஸை பற்றி அடையாளப்படுத்துறது வெட்கம். ஸோ அவர் வந்து 2 உதாரணங்கள் கொடுத்தவர். அவருடைய ஆர்கனைசேஷன் ஏசாப் வந்து தமிழ் பொது இடங்கள்ல கொண்டாட்டம் அந்த மிகவும் மெயின் ஸ்ட்ரீமான ஒரு இடங்கள்ல வந்து அவை பூத் போடுறது. இப்போ பூத்ல ஃப்ரீ காண்டம்ஸ் வைக்கிறது. இந்த காண்டம் பேக்கேஜ் வந்து அதில் அடையாளப்படுத்தல, அந்த காண்டம் அடையாளப்படுத்தல. மிகவும் கவர்ச்சியான ஒரு கருத்துரை, மிகவும் ஒரு மாடர்னான ஆர்டிஸ்டிக் கலை வடிவமான ஒரு உரை. அப்போ அதை என்னன்னு தெரியாம நிறைய பேர் எடுத்துக்கொள்ள வேண்டும் அந்த காண்டம் பேக்கெட்டை. அப்போ சில ஆட்கள் வந்து அந்த காண்டம் பேக்கெட்டை இவைகளுக்கு முன்னாலே திறந்து பார்ப்பேன். திறந்து பார்த்து பட்டுன்னு போட்டுவிடும் மேசையில. அதை தொட்டாலே ஒரு அரியண்டா, அது தொட்டாலே ஒரு கருத்தம், இல்லாட்டி ஒரு பக்கம். அப்ப அவர் என்ன சொல்றாருன்னா அது ஏன் அந்த பக்கம் பண்ணினா, பிகாஸ் அந்த அவையில் அந்த மேசில இல்லாத நேரம் அவன் சைட்ல போய் ஓரமா இருந்து பார்க்க குறுகுறுண்டு கொண்டதெல்லாம் மக்கள் வந்து அடிக்கினான். இவே முன்னுக்கு இருந்தாதான் நல்ல ஒரு பப்ளிக் ஒரு பயிரங்க அரங்கில செக்ஸை பற்றி கதைக்கிறதோ அதை பற்றி தொடர்பு கொள்றதோ தமிழ் மக்கள் இடையில ஒரு பக்கம் இருக்குது சொல்ல வர மிகவும் சிறந்த ஒரு கருத்து. கடைசியாக அவருடைய பேச்சில் அவர் சொன்னது என்னன்னா, இப்படிப்பட்ட ஒரு MSM இல்லாட்டி கே இல்லாட்டி குயர் பல விதமான வரைவிலக்கணங்கள் ஊடாக வர ஆண்களுக்கும் பெண்களுக்கும் ஒரு தளம் இருக்கிறதா? இஸ் தேர் a safe space? பிகாஸ் அந்த அவையில் ஒன்று சேரைக்கையும் அந்த வெளியில இருக்கிற அந்த நான் எப்படி இருக்கணும் என்ற ஒரு அந்த தளங்கள்ல வர அந்த பிரதிபிம்பத்தை உள்வாங்கி internal homophobia ஆக்கள் இருக்கீங்க. Like how race is performed இல்லையா? ஹிப் ஹாப் வீடியோ, குட் ஐடியா. இப்படித்தான் கருப்பு ஆண்கள் இருக்கணும் என்ற ஒரு ஹிப் ஹாப் வீடியோ. அதை பார்த்து நான் உள்வாங்கி நானும் அப்படித்தான் பிரதிபலிக்கணும் என்ற ஒரு கல்ச்சரல் ரேஸ் பெர்ஃபார்மன்ஸ். அதே மாதிரி கே மக்களிடையும் குயர் மக்களிடையும் அது அந்த பிரதிபிம்பத்தை உள்வாங்கி அதை பிரதிபலிக்கிறதுக்கு மிகவுமான ஒரு ஸ்ட்ரெஸ் இருக்கிறதாக அவர் சொன்னவர். கடைசியா என்ன சொன்னவர் என்றால், தமிழ் கலாச்சாரத்தை பொறுத்தவரையில ஆண் என்றா இப்படிதான் இருக்கணும், மீச வச்சிருக்கணும், ஆண் மாதிரி நடக்கணும், பெண் மாதிரி நடந்தா பொன்னியன். பிகாஸ் ரிமெம்பர் ஹெட்ரோநார்மேட்டிவ் பேட்ரியார்கில பெண்களுக்கு பொசிஷன் குறைவு. ஸோ ஒரு ஆண் பெண்ணாக நடந்தா ஏற்கனவே ரைட் பொன்னியன். பிகாஸ் ஒரு ப்ரொஃபஸர் எனக்கு ஒரு கசைன்னு சொன்னவர், நீ என்ன கலாச்சாரத்தை பற்றி படிக்கிறியோ தூசண சொற்களை முதல் எழுது, எல்லா தூசண சொற்களையும் பட்டியல் போட்டுக்கொண்டு வா. அந்த தூசண சொற்கள்ல இருந்து உனக்கு தெரியும் யாருக்கு அந்த சமுதாயத்துல பவர் இருக்குது, யாருக்கு பவர் இல்லை, என்ன கான்டெக்ட்ல பவர் இருக்கு, தூசண சொற்கள். சோ அவர் அதை மிகவும் கலைப்பூர்வமாகவும் மிகவும் திறமையாகவும் எடுத்துரைத்தார். நன்றி, வணக்கம்.